You talked about the dream selling. Why? I mean, was it a dream that inspired you to do your documentary? What?
Well, I actually always wanted to make narrative films and there was no way I could get the money to do that. So, and I'd been in production for a very long time, working in television and the commercial world, and so I had to do something for myself because I wanted to be a director. So I found a subject that I thought was really interesting and I thought I could tell a good story with, and I got a camera and I learnt how to shoot, and I went out and tried to tell a good story. But my film is, I think, a commercial kind of film, and when we would try to get finishing funds and look for money, we couldn't go to any, we couldn't get money because it was just this commercial film. Like, we couldn't go to certain groups because they were looking for this kind of film, or they were looking, so we'd run down the list, and we could maybe get money from like an arts, because he's a really creative chef, so we thought we couldn't, and so we just begged, borrowed and stole and finished the film. But yeah, so it's funny sometimes doing the rounds of the festivals, and you've got this film that's got no issues.
Yeah.
Well, let's start.
Yeah,
Let's start at that point. The audience, some of them may be familiar with the films. They may have seen them already in the festival and all that. But why don't you give us an encapsulation of what your film is about, and we'll move down the panel. Although I think Biagio and Joke, you've already told us. but anyway.
Yeah, you can skip us if you want.
It's about a chef who was 24 when I started working with him, and he was the youngest chef to get 3 stars from the New York Times. And we follow him over probably a 9.5-year period. But it's more about an artist trying to make it in New York, and somebody who's really dedicated and cooks at a really, really high level, and just his dedication in New York and how tough it is. And it also touches on critics and the influence that critics have in culinary world, and and it's he's a really creative person, so anybody that's of that creative bent feels can really get involved in the film. So
can I ask, was there a moment, now I ask all of you to supply this as you tell us about your film, was there a moment when early on in the discussion there was a notion that when you go out there you don't know what you're going to get sometimes? Okay, was there something that happened when you started shooting that kind of surprised you and took you in another direction somewhere?
Well, I thought I was going to make it about his creative process and how does he come up with these ideas, and I thought I was going to shoot several chefs, and I thought but some people can't actually articulate their creative process, and also with food, you're working in a visual medium, you're not working with taste or smell, so you've only got this, and with Paul, his food was the most beautiful food that I filmed. So I found that I'd shot all these other chefs, but nothing could impart, we were trying to impart taste to the viewers. So we stuck with Paul because he visually was but he still couldn't articulate his process. So even though that was sort of the aim of the film, it started taking on this other life because it was very, very difficult for him to tell us where these things came from.
You didn't have to hire a food stylist to make it look good.
No,
okay. All right.
So my film is more issue-oriented. It's about a little town in the Bible Belt of Tennessee, and the story takes off on the night that Obama's elected, and it's a town that it basically has seen a lot of demographic growth with Latinos that came in the 90s, and then about 800 Somali refugees that came to work in the Tyson chicken plant. So it brings up a lot of issues about newcomers and immigration, and really regular people who are not particularly concerned with being politically correct, speaking their mind about what it's like to have their town change, and how the different people are navigating. So there's a little bit of fish out of water kind of phenomenon. But I would say, in terms of the question about what it started out where there was this impetus that there was a sort of it started with this idea that with some people I was going to try to tell a story about immigration, and so there were these two groups of Latinos and Somalis. And when I went down there, this place in Tennessee, which is a town about, I don't know, 12,000 people, small, and sits within, a stone's throw of Pulaski, where the KKK was born. And given that it was on the eve of Obama's election, which was historic for many reasons, the African American contingent of third and fourth generation long-time African Americans in that town became really interesting to me as a kind of looking at, how can you tell this story of today and tomorrow and these newcomers without looking back at what they went through with civil rights, and have them kind of vocalize, because I felt like they had a choice of either kind of siding with the longtime white residents of like, we don't want these newcomers, or they could say, wait a second, this is make some connections. This feels bad. This feels like kind of what my grandmother went through. And so there's those kinds of things that people began to process and articulate, and hopefully it's a snapshot of a very dynamic year in the nation's history.
So our film was about our friend Steve Maison, who's a stand-up comic, had been a stand-up comic making his living, and was diagnosed with incurable liver cancer, and worst case scenario, given 5 years to live. And instead of being the victim and going, oh, woe is me, he said, there's worse things to deal with things and laugh about it. So he went and committed himself completely to his quest to make it on the Letterman show. He gave himself 1 year to get on, and that was 6 years ago. So he didn't quite make that year. But it's a story about, again, chasing your dream, and as someone said, a love letter to perseverance. I think for us, the hard part of it being, as documentarians, it's nice to kind of be that outside, giving that subjective kind of your view of this new world that you're not a part of. But Steve was our friend. And so before we decided to do the documentary with him, because he came to us and asked us to document his journey, we said, well, we had to think about it, because there is that barrier that's a good thing, that's a separation, and we didn't have that. So we had to figure out a way of working together where we could do that. And so we said, listen, if you have bad news, we can't just put the camera down and come and give you a hug. We actually have to then document what you're going through. So
which Steve's answer, by the way, was classic, because we told him that, basically saying, we're not going to be able to be your friend while we're making the movie, and he just kind of sat there for a second and went, oh, you just made my tumors hurt. So I think that really sums him up. But
yeah,
go ahead.
That pretty much set the tone right there.
Yeah.
I think the one moment for us that was kind of, oh my goodness, I can't believe this is happening, is when he got the letter early on in the process from the David Letterman show that this was impossible. I mean, they literally said impossible. It was never going to happen. He was not going to get on Letterman. As a friend, we were heartbroken. We were like, oh my God. And as a filmmaker, we went, oh my goodness, we have a movie.
Yeah, and that's true. It was our, but we talked to him about it after the movie was done. It was like every single time something horrible happened to him, it was like, oh, you felt so bad, but you're like, oh, Yahtzee. Thank goodness. First act turning point, second act turning point. Thank goodness. So,
Galea?
Yes, my film Beyond This Place, which is screening tonight, if any of you haven't seen it yet, at 5:45, is a personal documentary, and it's about my relationship with my father. The film questions his absence in my life, and tries to also bring up the questions of freedom and responsibility. How free can one be before one takes the freedom away from someone else? And my father, whose name is Cloud Rock, which should sum up the story, is a diehard 60s hippie going strong. And the film tries to trace his reasons for being absent and giving him the opportunity to voice himself as a male born in 1941, as a hippie, as a father, and as an individual. And the format of the film is a cycling tour, which begins in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, and ends at Mount St. Helens. And tied into this is my biography, which also begins in Maui, in this very special hippie commune on Maui, and my then going to Detroit and with my mother later, and ending up in Switzerland, which isn't actually part of the story, how I end up in Switzerland. But so this film, because it's a personal story, it was very important to me as a filmmaker. It wasn't, the motivation of the film wasn't to go through family therapy on tape with my father, who I don't know, or to get to know my father in front of an audience. I felt that the topic itself of father-son relationships, parent-child relationships, the hippie generation, today's generation, the children of the hippies, had enough to it to actually involve an audience, to interest an audience. And also this question of freedom and responsibility, I feel, is extremely important to not only looking at relationships, but also trying to think about our society today, and whether that's where one buys one's clothes from, or how, if one rides a bicycle instead of driving the car, all these different things, how responsible do we have to be, what is the price of our freedoms? So this is all tied into this relationship, and it develops over the course of the film, up over this bike, through, the bicycle being the vehicle, which we come to this
It
volcano.
sounds like, almost silly to ask, what surprises along the way, because life is a series of surprises along the way, and if you're doing a personal journey like that. But did you get surprised by anything your father said when you were actually making this?
Again and again, yeah.
For
For example, we start off on our trip, and I'm going to give away something from the film, but it's okay. We start off on this trip, and he's talking about freedom, and I ask him, is freedom the most important thing to you? And he says, yes, of course, freedom is the only thing. It's the most important thing. And I say, what about your children? And he gives some kind of, he doesn't really know. What about the children? And I say responsibility, and he says, nobody's guilty of anything, not even the most hardened criminals. So actually, and then he says, actually, you picked me, so you have to find out why you chose me. This isn't about me, this is about you. Why did you choose me as a father? So, okay, this is the beginning point of this dialogue about why weren't you there for me, which is really him saying, I have to decide why I chose him. So that was
Getting a
very
little
surprising.
metaphysical here.
Well, it's but this was the layer of the discussion, so, and surprising as well. It wasn't just me and him. Then there's also like secondary characters who come into the film who give input into the background and of personal background of Cloud Rock, personal background of the hippie community in Maui, and it took an interesting turn in that it developed to this freedom responsibility thing. This wasn't what I was pitching when I was developing the film about freedom and responsibility. This developed out of the film, and it developed through also the secondary characters, and it became what I realized. What this was the essence of the film was this question. And the most surprising thing that happened, I asked this question to one of the secondary characters, a very important secondary character, and he had no answer. And it wasn't just that he had no answer, he had never even considered it. And that was, to me, such a surprise. It was a question to a generation which I felt they had never considered.